everyone, welcome to the July 15th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Milkowski, and a lot to look forward to this weekend as Saratoga has begun in 2022. We're recording this on Friday morning. Opening day was yesterday. Fun day of racing, but plenty to look forward to over the next 8 weeks. It's just a fun time in horse racing. It feels like everybody who's interested in wagering on the races is dialed into this meet. And Craig, this Saturday card is pretty good. We've got a couple of stakes on tap. I know some complaints about the field makeup in the Diana with Chad Brown having 2/3 of the runners, but that Sanford came up a total war.
Yeah, it's a strong card, and as for the Diana, I mean, if you're not used to that by now, I'm not sure where you've been. We've been seeing plenty of races with multiple Chad Brown horses, and they're all in there to win it. So I don't have any problem with that race.
Craig and I are going to talk about the late pick 5 sequence, races 7 through 11. That includes both of those stakes races. Those spread out a little bit. They go off as races 8 and 10. We do have a couple of interesting allowance races in the mix, including one that starts it off with a pretty talented runner signed on, and we close things out with a claimer to end the card on the turf. And Craig, given the makeup of this sequence and kind of knowing you, I'm guessing this is one that you might have some interest in, because it feels like there are a few spots that you might be able to anchor your play around, and some other legs where you can catch prices.
Yeah, for me, this is probably one where I would anchor my play. I agree with you. I do think it's one where I'm going to be pretty short in a lot of the legs. And the first leg is definitely one of those with reinvestment risk. I went through the race just trying to come up with an alternative to beat him. And personally, I just couldn't do it. I'd be interested to hear if you had a different look. But he just seems like much the best horse to me in here. I mean, there's a couple others I thought about. Baby Yoda always pops up. He usually runs well, but he has that reputation that's really not backed up. He had a couple of fast races, but he ran second the Flight Line in the Malibu, even though he was well beaten. But he just doesn't seem to be the horse he was earlier in his career. So he's not for me. On the TimeformUS pace projector, there's not a ton of speed in here, and we have a pretty talented horse in River Dog shown on the front end, who's won 4 out of 7 races, run some decent figures, but I have questions about him too. He might be tailing off. He's a horse who won his first 2 starts and tailed off. Came off a long layoff, won 2 starts, and then he tailed off a little last time in that stake at Monmouth, and I just think he might be flattered a little bit. And one of his wins at 7 came over a sloppy track. So I wasn't really interested in him. So for me, if I do play the pick 5, it would probably be with reinvestment risk as a single.
Yeah, I agree. It's pretty hard to get around that heavy favorite reinvestment risk in this first leg of the sequence, which is an optional claimer, non-bonus of 2 other than going the 7 furlong distance on the main track. And just seems like reinvestment risk has found a really nice spot, or at least Chad Brown has found one for him, because he's a horse that has placed in multiple grade 1 races. He's actually finished second in grade 1 events in 4 out of his 8 career starts. He has won against Maiden and Allowance Company before. So he just fits this condition really well, dropping in class. He's been beaten by Jackie's Warrior and Speaker's Corner in his last couple of starts. So this is significant class relief for him. And Craig, it's not like he's a horse that has to come from that far off the pace. So I'm not too concerned about him being compromised by a potential lone leader like that number 7 River Dog, or perhaps the number 8 Sibelius. It just feels like he's the kind of horse that can get into a pretty good stalking spot, like he did 2 back in the Carter when he actually ran well to be second ahead of Mind Control. He's just a really classy horse who's supposed to collect his 3rd career victory here.
Yeah, that's the way I saw it as well. I guess the other horse maybe you could try to make a case for would be Disco Pharaoh, who's drawn inside and ran those 2 big races. He had that huge maiden win, and then he won a stake at Laurel with speed figures that would be competitive in here. But he just seems to have gone off a cliff. Maybe a little bit of excuse at the break in those last 2, but not enough for me to think that they would get him back to his top efforts.
Yeah, I will say if you watch that last race for Disco Farrow, where he was also in against Nova Rags and Fitzpatrick, who are in this race as well, Disco Farrow did not have a great trip there. He was kind of shuffled back a little bit early. He was trying to move up between horses on the turn, and it just seemed like Dylan Davis couldn't quite get him in the spot that he wanted to, and this horse had to steady pretty badly at the quarter pole. Had his chance in the stretch, but maybe just couldn't recover from that trouble at the, coming off the turn, and he ultimately finished fifth, but a pretty close fifth. Reading the DRF Clocker reports, mixed signals about this horse and how he's been training recently, which kind of goes along with what you were saying, that maybe he has gone the wrong way. If I was going to look for somebody else in this race to use underneath reinvestment risk, I'd actually be most interested in the number 8 Sibelius. Not so much from a pick 5 standpoint, because I do think that reinvestment risk is, pretty much a single in this race. But if you were going to play an exacta and try to get a horse underneath in the verticals, I think that Sibelius is interesting. He's just outrun his odds consistently in recent starts, and I don't mind the slight turn back to 7 furlongs for him at all. He's got the early speed to be perched right off Riverdog, and I don't fully trust Riverdog to get 7 furlongs, and I think Sibelius could inherit the lead at some point in this race and hang on for second. I mean, he was a pretty close third to highly motivated and stage trader last time, who are pretty talented horses from the Chad Brown barn.
Yeah, he would definitely be my exacta play, especially if the odds line up as you have him on the morning line, where he's taken a lot less money than Baby Yoda, Disco Farrow. His speed figures are not that far off of reinvestment risk. He ran a 115 last time, and that running line kind of points to the turn back being a good thing for him.
Do you put any credence in this idea that Baby Yoda is just this Saratoga freak that is going to suddenly turn back into the horse that beat Olympiad last summer when he gets back on that main track at Saratoga, or has he just gone the wrong way?
I mean, I guess you could put some credence in it, but I mean, he was in pretty decent form at the time. He had broke his maiden easily in that maiden claimer at Pimlico. I mean, I guess if you're a big horse for course angle, you can fall back on that. But my eyes tell me he's not the same horse.
I tend to agree with you. If he's going to be the second choice in here, he's a little tough for me to make a case for using underneath and exactas and triples particularly, but it just feels like reinvestment risk is the kind of horse that you want to lean on pretty heavily and then move on, try to be clever somewhere else in this sequence. And let's move on to the next leg. It is the Grade 1 Diana, the feature race on this opening weekend at Saratoga. They're going 1.1 miles on the Mellon turf course this year. I believe this race historically has been run on the inner, but they're changing it up this year to go on that outer turf course. 6 signed on for this one, 4 out of the Chad Brown barn. 3 of those are owned by Peter Brandt, so it'll be interesting to see how the tactics work on all of these runners with common trainership. But Greg, it's a pretty nice field. We have a bunch of 4-year-old fillies who do have plenty of upside, and it's not going to be a big surprise if we see multiple horses out of this field in the Breeders' Cup later in the year.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And it's also pretty interesting from a pace perspective, I think. When you look at the pace projector, the 2 horses shown on the front end are both Chad Brown horses, but they are have different owners. The outside horse in Italian is one of those Peter Brandt entrants, but Claravit Stables is technical analysis. So I'm not sure what's going to happen with those 2. And you also throw in Dalika, who at times has shown she can be really fast. Normally it's in the really long races, the 1 3/8, 1.5 miles. But last time at Churchill, she showed pretty high speed going 1 1/16, opened up a big lead and just couldn't hold off Gam's Mission. So for me, I think the pace is really interesting in here. We don't have a flag on it as a fast pace, but as I look through it, I would say at least 3 of the horses really want to be up front to do their best running.
Yeah, I'm curious to know how the 2 Chad Brown speed horses are going to use their speed in this race, those being technical analysis and in Italian. In Italian has kind of been used as a bit of a pacemaker for some Peter Brandt owned stablemates in recent starts, particularly Speak of the Devil and Regal Glory. Last time, it was very apparent in the Just a Game that was the role for In Italian. Technical analysis, though, different ownership. She's a Claravich Stables horse, but she does seem like she does her best running on the lead. So it's going to be interesting to see if one of these horses is in there to press the pace. I kind of get the sense that all 4 of these Chad Brown runners are in there to kind of get legitimate rides to win the race, because they all do have the talent to deserve a spot in this field. So we'll see how that shakes out. And like you said, Dalika, she's a horse that can run off on the front end sometimes. So I don't think that she's just going to concede the lead to either of those Chad Brown runners. But Craig, we should really talk quite a bit about the favorite in this race, the number 3 Bleecker Street, who is way the horse to beat off her effort in the New York last time. I kind of have mixed feelings about her because I'm becoming a fan of this horse. How can you not? She's now 7 for 7 in her career, but I've kind of questioned her in the past, and I feel like it's a little bit late for me to jump on the bandwagon now that the public is finally going to be all over her.
Yeah, I think we're in similar spots here where I've tried to beat her multiple times and it hasn't worked out. And I think she's finally won me over. I definitely have to use her. She's a strong player in here. I really liked what I saw last time out in that New York Stakes where she jumped into Grade 1 company and she just keeps on improving her speed figure. It wasn't the greatest pace scenario that day for her, and she just rolled by that field. I even think the half length margin's a little bit deceiving. Um, she was much the best in my opinion. So she's one, given that there is some speed in here, I have to use her, but she's not one I'm going to be able to single because I like technical analysis as well. I'm not sure what kind of trip. I assume she's going to have to go from the inside, but she is a horse who's been able to rate just off the lead a couple times if you go back in her PPs and win. She has better speed figures than Bleecker Street. So for me, it's probably going to be those two. Another horse I wanted to mention was we have a Charlie Appleby ship in, who we saw last year in Creative Flair. And your 8-1 morning line, that pretty much says it all for me. I don't think she really fits with this group. We saw her last year in a couple weaker races as a 3-year-old, and she wasn't able to get the job done. She won a pretty weak Grade 2 in Maidan. Only got a 111 time form rating that day. So normally I just will automatically use the Charlie Appleby's, but this isn't going to be one of them.
Yeah, Bleecker Street is a horse that just seems to step up to meet her competition. And I mean, we haven't really seen her ceiling yet because she's met and surpassed every challenge so far. That win in the New York last time, I mean, the final quarter mile that she put in that day was just dazzling. I looked up it on I mean, I didn't really appreciate it so much at the time, how fast she came home, until I was handicapping this race and looked it up on Trackis. Trackis has her coming home with making that last to first move over the final quarter in 21.7 seconds, which is just insane for a closing fraction in a 1.25-mile race. They did kind of go at a crawl early, so the entire field was coming home pretty fast, but I mean, she was just flying at the end of that race. And if she produces that kind of late kick in this Diana, it's hard to see her losing. I don't love the idea of taking her at close to even money, and I do think that the bettors are just going to go all in on her in this race because at some point this allure of the undefeated horse is irresistible for so many players. So, I mean, I get it. And I think she deserves to have her bandwagon growing just based on what she's done on the racetrack. But I was impressed last time, and I think she's much the horse to beat, just a little bit concerned about perhaps a lack of value on her. Craig, what do you make of Rougier? She looked so good in the Beaugay when she won her first start in this country, but I just can't find an excuse for the New York last time.
No, I tried to make a case for her when I was handicapping this race, and the only explanation I could come up with was that Beaugay, even though it was listed as firm, we have that as a 6 on that TimeformUS 1 to 10 track condition scale. And as you look through her past performances, her better efforts come when there's some give in the turf, and there certainly was not on the on Belmont Day, and there's certainly not going to be on Saturday, barring something changing and it pouring down rain. It's probably going to be a firm course. So for me, that's what it looks like. She is just one that needs some give in the ground and didn't get it last time.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would also just add a little bit of insight into the way the course has been playing at Belmont, or was playing at Belmont over the spring-summer meet. There were a couple of weeks where they had the rail set at 9 feet on the inner turf course. It was the middle of May when Rougier ran in the Beaugay, and then in June, I think the 16th to 19th, which I think people caught people's eyes a little bit more. But if you look back at both of those weeks, outside moves really were preferred on the inner turf course. And Rougier got a wide trip that day that I think some people people thought maybe elevated her performance, but potentially it actually made it look a little better than it was in the Bogey. And like you said, she regressed last time. Maybe the firm ground didn't work for her, but I need to see her really take a step forward for this barn because we haven't seen it yet, and it's hard for me to see her turn in the tables on Bleecker Street based on the way they ran last time. Craig, I went in a slightly different direction. I was initially trying to make the same case for technical analysis that you did, but as I was scanning back through this field, I kind of posed the question to myself, why am I assuming that technical analysis as a speed horse is better than In Italian? I mean, they have very similar speed figures. In Italian is going to be a much bigger price, and I guess people just assume that she's in here to be a pacemaker for her two Peter Brandt stablemates. But, I mean, she's a pretty nice horse in her own right, and I would argue that she's subtly been improving in her last couple of starts without ideal setups. I mean, remember, she was inside on that Churchill Downs turf course in the Distaff Turf Mile, and we were so taken by the late move on the outside, Speak the Devil, who just came home so fast over the last 3/8 of a mile. But In Italian was guided right down to the rail in the stretch by Arad Ortiz, and it's not like she completely threw in the towel hanging on for second. And then last time, that just a game pace was so fast on the front end, and she actually hung in okay to be third. The distance is a question. I don't know what kind of trip she's going to get, but I would say the exact same things about technical analysis, and In Italian is going to be a much bigger price.
Yeah, I have no problem with using her. I don't think she's in here to be a pace setup. And I do think she'll be on the lead, but she also has options from that outside post if the lead and technical analysis get frisky on the front end and go for it. She could sit a nice pocket trip. So I do think she's a player in here, and I prefer her much more than the others outside of Bleecker Street and technical analysis.
Let's move on to race 9. It's an optional claiming 80,000. Non-winners of one other than is the allowance condition going 1.125 miles on the turf course for 3-year-olds. Optional claimer doesn't really matter for this race because I don't think anybody's in for the optional claiming tag. It's really just an N1X allowance. Craig, we've got a horse in here that I know we talked about on the Pacecast a few weeks ago. The number 9, Fort Ticonderoga, who broke his maiden last time out for Shug McGahee coming off a long layoff. Was this horse's first start on the turf. He's got a big turf pedigree, was visually impressive that day, earned a really nice speed figure. All the trappings of a horse that's probably going to take a lot of money facing winners for the first time, but I also think he's pretty good.
Yeah, he's one that there's another horse I like in here at a price. I'm probably going to use him equally, but it was pretty tough for me to get past Fort Ticonderoga. I didn't want to like him in here because of what you said. He's going to get bet pretty heavily off those lines with those connections, that big win last time. So, yeah, he's one I think you have to use. He's got much the best speed figure on the TimeformUS speed figures, but I don't want to hand the race to him. I do think he got a pretty good trip last time out with a really hot pace. He was able to tuck in behind and just kind of pass the front runners. And even though we had that fast pace, the horse he beat, Growth Capital, did hold on for second. It's not like there were others flying up at him. So it kind of set up really nicely for him. I want to use him, but I don't want to just rely on him totally. A horse who I think's a little dirtied up from his Churchill races, the 5-horse Summer Anthem, and he's the other one that I want to lean on pretty heavily in here. Well, they will definitely be my 2 A's in the race, and it's just one of those things. He ran on that Churchill course we've talked about many times on both of our shows. He was on that inside part of the course, which just has not been the place to be. At a really fast pace, and for me, I'm just putting a line through that. It was in that Audubon Stakes won by Kitadan. But before that, I really liked how he broke his maiden in Keeneland. He was able to chase a runoff leader, a horse that just opened up big on the field, sat in second, took over and held on with a nice speed figure that day. So I'm looking for more of that kind of race for Summer Anthem. He could be on the front end. He's certainly got plenty of early speed, and I think he's really dangerous in here.
Yeah, I hear you on Summer Anthem's last race not being a true indicator of his ability because, like you said, fast pace, not the right trip on that turf course. I do have doubts about the speed figure for his maiden win. That feels like one of those races at Keeneland that they went fast early, and it seemed like the whole field got pulled along to a faster speed figure than they really should have been able of achieving. I mean, horses have come back, especially him and the second place finish, or the winner, I should say. I'm sorry, the second place finisher have come back to regress out of that race. Other horses who finished in behind have also regressed. I don't quite buy that number, and that's the one number that makes him competitive in this race. So I'm a little bit skeptical of that, but he does figure to have the early lead in here, and I think that's always going to be dangerous on the turf course. We saw that on Thursday at Saratoga, especially on the inner turf with that Clement horse who didn't look like the speed on paper. She was sent to the lead by Javier Castellano and was able to wire the field. Just feels like sometimes in these two-turn turf routes at Saratoga, the jocks are not that aggressive, so you do want to pay attention to who could be forwardly placed in this race. And kind of going along those lines, Craig, another horse that I think could be somewhat forward in here at a big price that I want to include is the number 7 Constitution Lawyer. This would be his turf debut, but this is a horse that I have been waiting to see run on the turf for a very long time, ever since he was in the maiden races, because if you look through his pedigree, he's got some real European turf breeding on the bottom. I know his dam sire is Lawyer Ron, but his dam is by Lawyer Ron out of a European turf family. His second dam was multiple Group 1 placed in Europe, and this horse is by Constitution. The Constitutions can certainly handle the turf. I know we didn't like the synth at turf weight 2 back. I don't care about that too much. Just the way this horse moves, he's got a bit of a turfy look to me, and I'm not going to be surprised when he likes this surface. It's not the easiest spot for him to try it, and if you look up some stats in Formulator, Ray Handel has just awful numbers with first-time turfers. I think he's 0 for 26 making this move over the past 5 years, but this horse is going to be a gigantic price, so I don't want to get too caught up in that, and he could be one that's somewhat forward in this race, so I do want to include him. Is there anybody else that you wanted to take a look at here, Craig? There is a Chad Brown rider in this race, the number 6 credit event, but he feels like one that I thought might take money just because it's Chad Brown. I didn't like his form that much.
No, I don't like him. If he beats me, he beats me. He hasn't really run particularly fast. Just wasn't a fan of him. And it's Irad Ortiz and Chad Brown. You know they're going to get over bet. The one other horse I'm going to use lesser than the other two that we mentioned is Analogy, the 4 horse. He's a horse who went wire to wire to break his maiden, ran a nice 100 speed figure. But then his last race, he kind of had a little trouble at the back. He found himself in last place in that race. But I really like how he was able to regroup and made a strong run at the finish. Didn't quite match the same speed figure, only ran a 96 this time. But I like what I saw. So for a horse at a price, I'm going to use him too.
Yeah, it's funny. I wanted to make a case for Analogy in this race, and I kind of wanted to like him when I first saw that race coming out of it. I was actually looking at trips that week for my Horses to Watch video. It was a week that I was on vacation, so I was intently watching all the races that I missed, and I at first thought I was going to make the case to highlight Analogy on that show, but the more I looked at that race, it just felt like one of those allowance races where the entire field hit the wire together. I think the top 5 finishers were separated by maybe 3/4 of a length or a half length. It just feels like not a particularly strong race, and I think this is a much tougher spot. I agree, Analogy is the one you want out of there. I just wasn't quite convinced that he was going to be able to make the jump into a tougher class level here. The horse that I don't want to just go without mentioning is the number 10 Daunt, because I think he has faced some slightly better horses. He ran well as a 2-year-old to break his maiden in his second start, and since then, he's just faced Stakes Company, some pretty good rivals. I mean, Emmanuel obviously didn't get to compete in the Belmont Derby, and maybe the Pennine Ridge wasn't the best prep for that race, but it's not like he was disgraced against those horses. He's now dropping back into an N1X, getting Lasix. I know that this isn't a trainer that wins that often, but that also means he's probably going to be a bigger price than his speed figures say that he should. So he's one that I wouldn't want to let beat me either.
One you haven't really talked about other than in the beginning was Fort Ticonderoga. What do you think of his chances?
Oh, yeah, I probably should have stated it explicitly. I agree with everything you said. I liked this horse's maiden win a lot. I think he has plenty of talent. He did get a pretty good setup in there, and the runner-up is a little bit of a hanger, but he ran by that horse pretty easily in the late stages. Shug McGahee had a little bit of a quiet Belmont meet, finishing second and third a lot, but I feel like he's primed to really wake up at Saratoga, and horses like this are a good example. It just seems like he's he's one that's really well placed to begin this meet. And I also think the slight stretch out to 1.125 is really going to be ideal for this horse. He feels like one that has the stamina to handle this stretch out and trip. So yeah, he's my top pick in here. I like him quite a bit, just not that excited about the likelihood of a short price, which is why I wanted to highlight a couple of other long shots like Constitution Lawyer and Daunt that I would also want to use as B and C types in an ABC wager.
Yeah, one thing, just a little bit off topic that I want to point out. These allowance races, with the way purses are kind of exploding at some of these big meets, are getting really good again. And just as a racing fan, I like seeing this.
Totally. We've got some horses that are dropping out of stakes, some really promising allowance runners, or horses, I should say, coming out of maiden races. It's just an interesting mix, and you typically do get that at Saratoga. Let's move on to the second stakes on this card. It is the fourth leg of this Pick 5 sequence. Race 10, the Grade 3 Sanford, going 6 furlongs for the 2-year-olds. And Craig, I don't know about you, but I usually think about these opening week races at Saratoga as being not great indicators of who the best 2-year-olds are going to be. The Schuylerville and the Sanford, the fields sometimes are a little bit weak. Horses haven't run that fast. This is one of the best Sanfords that I can remember going back a decade or two. I mean, this field is just loaded with talent and impressive maiden winners.
Yeah, it is. The Sanford, as you said, it hasn't always been that strong. The connections have been tending to wait for the better races, but not so much. Not the case this year at all. We have plenty of good horses in here. Deep field, full field at 12, which hasn't always been the case. And as you said, we've seen some pretty big speed figures from a couple of the runners as well. So if you saw the race yesterday, the two top speed figure horses kind of ran away from the field, and it's kind of what I'm looking for in here, though I do think there's some other players that are maybe better than their speed figures would show.
Well, I think the top 2 speed figure horses that you're referring to both broke for maidens at Belmont Park, those being Forte and Andiamo a Firenze, the younger half-brother to Firenze Fire, who, I should say, won the Sanford, so he's got the pedigree to be successful in this race. Craig, but what do you make of Forte? I would say he wasn't beating that much in his debut at Belmont, but boy, did he look good doing it, and he ran the kind of speed figure that makes him the horse to beat in this spot.
Yeah, he wasn't beating much, and it probably exaggerated the margin, but that 100 speed figure's the best in the field. And more importantly for me is the way he did it. He didn't have to be one of these 2-year-olds that just go to the lead, run away from everybody. He was actually not in the lead as they turned for home. So I liked what I saw from Forte. I do think he's a must use in here. I would expect the stretch out from 5 to 6 furlongs to be a positive for him based on the way he showed up in that debut. So he's one I think you have to use. The other big speed figure horse, the horse you're talking about, Andiamo a Firenze, I'm not quite as high on. His speed figure was fine. It was a 98, but he looked like that more typical fast 2-year-old that gets out on the lead. He did it on a sloppy track. It's not that he can't win this race. He certainly can. I'm just not sure he's going to offer much value for the relative merits that he has. The sloppy track always concerns me. Those were New York bred, so we're talking about the field for the Forte. That was probably even a weaker field. We don't know that for sure with 2-year-olds. There hasn't been many runbacks, but just not quite the same level. So of those two, I prefer Forte.
Yeah, I agree. Both of those did earn nice speed figures. Forte is the one who showed a little bit more professionalism, sitting off the pace and passing horses. You always like to see that, but they're both moving way up in class here like everybody else is. The one thing I'll add about Forte is I know Todd Pletcher has a reputation for doing really well in these races, and if you go back a decade or more, he was pretty dominant in a lot of the 2-year-old stakes. Over the past 5 years, when you look in Formulator, Pletcher coming off debut wins in graded stakes dirt sprints, he's just 3 for 24 with an ROI that's barely above $1. So he has not been doing well in these races over the past 5 years. And I think his only graded stakes winner in one of these 2-year-old stakes at Saratoga during that time with a horse that just won its debut was Witt last year. So, the recent pattern, not great for Forte, but I agree. He's one that is kind of hard to get around based on the speed figure here around, though I am interested in some other horses in here. And I want to talk about a few two of them coming from out of town. You've got a few Churchill shippers in this race, two that are drawn right towards the middle of the pack in the number 5 Curly Jack and the number 6 Mo Strike. They ran similar races first time out. They both had a lot of early speed. Curly Jack actually had to rush up a little bit after breaking somewhat slowly from the rail. But Craig, I think both these horses are a little dangerous.
Yeah, I prefer Curly Jack to Mo Strike just because he ran a much higher speed figure, but they're ones you certainly can't dismiss. I do wonder about the pace. We have it as a fast pace on the pace projector. I usually take that with a grain of salt with 2-year-olds because we don't really know the running style these horses have. Most of them are going to break their maiden on or really close to the lead. So I don't put a lot of stock in that. But with Andiamo a Firenze to his outside, who was really quick out of the gate, I wonder a little if he'd get challenged a bit in there. But yeah, with these 2-year-olds, you just don't know. And I don't want to rely too heavily on speed figures because we know these horses are changing basically by the day. I mean, we talk about it a lot with 3-year-olds. It's even more pronounced with 2-year-olds. And that's kind of why a couple other horses that I like in this field don't really have the speed figures to match. One of them is Major Dude, the other Todd Pletcher. I used air quotes there when I said it. His race came back pretty slow at Monmouth Park, but I like how he did it. He did some things you don't normally see from a 2-year-old first time out, where he was in traffic. Not only did he get held up a bit, which I think probably cost his speed figure when he was waiting for a hole. When he did get a seam, it was a pretty narrow seam, and he shot through it like a horse who has raced about 20 times, like an old veteran claimer. So I like what I saw from him. I'm not going to take the 78 too seriously, and I think he's a player in here. And another one I like has actually been running at Belmont, and that's for Rudy Rodriguez outside Valenzen Day. He's a horse who last out was taken way back. I think he's going to get some run in here. He should get a nice clean trip from the outside. His speed figure last time was only a 90, but I do think he had a little trouble at the start. It's kind of tough to tell in those 5.5 furlong races. But when you watch the head on it, it wasn't the cleanest break. And I just really liked how he finished off the race. So with any kind of pace, I think he's going to be a factor late as well.
Yeah, I ended up kind of going along the lines of what you were saying about the speed figures. Horses at this time of year can improve so much from start 1 to start 2. I mean, just think about a horse like High Oak that won the Saratoga Special last year, who had run a paltry speed figure in his debut at Belmont and then took a huge step forward second time out against Stakes Company. I mean, you can see big jumps like that. So I'm not putting too much stock in the speed figures, and I really wanted to veer towards the horses that kind of visually impressed me in this race. I agree with what you said about Major Dude, that Pletcher 2-year-old that won at Monmouth. I don't think he was facing a very good field, if I'm being kind, but I like what he did in the race. I agree with everything you said. I actually made my top pick, though, the other horse from Monmouth, the number 3, Great Navigator. This one earned a speed figure that's comparable with a lot of these. I mean, not the two favorites, but at least the horses coming in from Churchill. And when I look through the field that Great Navigator beat, it feels like that there was a little bit of quality in there. The third place finisher has come back to win with a higher speed figure. A few others have come back to run higher speed figures. And I really liked the visual impression that this horse left. I mean, he kind of like Forte did. I mean, he stalked the pace willingly. When he was asked to go on the turn, he just inhaled those runners, and he was really striding away well through the stretch. I mean, put to some pressure, but I liked the way he finished that race. These are low-profile connections that are not going to take a lot of money in here, and even lower-profile pedigree. I'm sure nobody's heard of the sire Sea Wizard, a son of Uncle Mo, but this horse kind of has that Uncle Mo line look to him, and it appears to have some precocity, so I think he's pretty dangerous, and it's going to be a big price in this race. And a horse that I think will be an even bigger price that I do want to include somewhere is the number 11, Put the Blame on Me. He's actually the one horse that you guys didn't assign a speed figure to, Craig. A race that just, I feel like came back very slow, but also a field of inexperienced horses, so I know sometimes it's hard to have confidence in those speed figures. I will say the buyer came back extremely low, 46, which doesn't make him competitive at all in this race, but it's a replay that you might want to go back and watch because this horse was barely ever let run during the race. I mean, Jose Ortiz went to Parks to ride this horse, and came out of the gate looking like he was riding a 12 furlong marathon. I mean, he was basically just back in the saddle, not asking for this horse for anything, as he just was running alongside the field on the outside very easily. He let him go for maybe an eighth of a mile at the top of the stretch, and he just shut the door on the field, and then he again geared him down coming to the wire. This is a much better performance than the speed figure would indicate. Jeremiah Engelhardt has very good numbers coming off debut wins when horses come back for their second starts. I just think he's a little bit sneaky in here, and he's going to get completely lost in the wagering.
Yeah, there's going to be some horses like that. I will say, if we gave this race a speed figure, I'm not exactly sure my assistant did this, why he decided not to. I think it was just so low he didn't trust it, and I can see why. It would have been about a 61, which would just be way below par for a 2-year-old maiden special weight at Parks, even in June. So I assume that's why, but I have no argument with anything you said. My one concern with those two would both be that they came at 4.5 furlongs. So they're stretching out quite a bit. But when you're playing horses at a big price, you can't really worry about things like that.
Let's move on to the last leg of this sequence. Back over to the turf course, it's a claiming $35,000 non-winners of 2 lifetime event, going 1 mile and a 16th on the melon for fillies and mares. And I think we're going to have a clear-cut favorite here, Craig, the number 4, Diva Ready. And maybe it was just a little bit of fatigue for me getting to the end of this Saturday card at Saratoga, but I kind of copped out with this one a little bit. She's just getting class relief that it seems like is going to benefit her. She was visually impressive when she broke her maiden 2 back at Delaware Park, and just seemed like she was in over her head against Allowance Company last time at Woodbine. Jonathan Thomas has good numbers dropping in for a tag for the first time, and it just feels like she's a horse that's placed to win.
Yeah, she's going to be tough. The pace projector certainly agrees that we have her shown on a clear lead. I've got no real arguments against her other than she's going to be a low price, but I wouldn't want to leave her off my ticket and get beat because she wins. It's going to be a tough sequence to structure tickets because I don't think any of the favorites really are horses you can toss. But again, you don't want to play tickets that have 4 and 5 favorites on them. So for me, it's going to take some work to really use the horses I like at a price and kind of use some of the favorites in other spots. So she's one that fits that bill. I'm certainly going to use her. I'm not going to use her on tickets where I have reinvestment risk singled and other favorites as well. So just something to keep in mind. But she is the horse to beat, but I am going to look at some others at a price. One horse, but before we get into that, I don't want to use, who's the second choice, I believe, on the morning line, is we have another one of those cases where it's a Chad Brown, Irad Ortiz combo. But I really think that horse would just be taking money because of the connections. She's run on the synthetic twice, hasn't run a fast race yet. So she's one I don't want any parts of. The ones I will be using, I like what I saw from Noble Enterprise last time she dropped down into the same class. Didn't get any real pace to run into, made a nice close into that race. Hard to use her and not Kemba outside, who finished in front of her, actually. My issue with that one is she draws the 11 hole this time, but I think she's a player. And another I wanted to use in here is just basically on the class drop Freedom Machine from the 10 hole. She's been running speed figures are competitive in here just against better horses. So I think she's one that could have a shot as well.
Yeah, I don't really have a lot to add to that. I'm pretty confident in Diva Ready in this race. I think that she just makes a lot of sense, but the backups that I would use are most of the horses that you mentioned. I'd be most interested in Freedom Machine in behind her. She's just getting that class relief. She ran reasonably well up here last summer with some tough trips and just seems like one that fits this race pretty well. Kemba, I don't love the post, but she was one that really got compromised at the start last time. She's a horse that wants to be much more forwardly placed than she was. And out of that weird start on the inner turf course, she had a wide post and just got pushed out, was way out of position early. I think even though she's drawn wide again, she's going to get a much better trip in this race because there's not much speed signed on, and Dylan Davis can get her forward. So I thought though they were the two that were most dangerous to cause upsets, but I didn't have too much clever to say here. Craig, let's go back a little bit and just talk a bit about ticket structure. I'll go first. I feel like when people look at this sequence, We're all going to be doing the same thing and leaning heavily on reinvestment risk in the first leg, but I suspect a lot of people are going to try to spread in the 9th and 11th races and go a little more chalky in the stakes, especially the Diana. I want to kind of zig in the other direction and go a little bit more chalky in the 9th and 11th and look for prices in both stakes, which is why I kind of highlighted an Italian in the Diana. She's a horse that I would use as an A, probably my only A in that race, and use a few other backups. And then in the Sanford, I really want to focus on some of those prices, like Great Navigator, Put the Blame on Me, and de-emphasize some of those shorter prices that I think are not going to make this a worthwhile sequence from a payout standpoint. So I'm going to go more with favorites in the 9th and 11th race. I really like Fort Ticonderoga. I'm not against Diva Ready in the finale. I'd use some backups that I would want to have covered if the long shots that I'm right about do win the stakes, but I kind of want to go about it from that standpoint and be right with my clever opinions in those two stakes races.
Yeah, I can understand that. And I'm kind of going to go that way. Although in the 9th, the allowance race, I'm going to lean pretty heavily on Summer Anthem. I do think he's going to get the lead, and that Churchill angle has really been paying off. So I'm going to stick with that one. You've kind of talked me into in Italian. I was kind of really torn on that race, but you've swayed me. I'm going to use her a little more heavily than what I thought I would. Some other price sources I would use, as we mentioned, I do like Valenzen Day in the Sanford. He's one I'm going to lean on pretty heavily as a price. So it's just one where I structure the tickets. I really want to make sure I'm not playing tickets that are going to come back with 4 and 5 favorites. Outside of that, it's a good favorite. And then if all the favorites win and I don't hit it, I can live with that. I don't want to cash those anyway, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's good to know about that. Know that that's your strategy when you're going into the sequence. And some people might find it unappealing that the sequence is beginning with a horse that just about everybody's going to single and reinvestment risk. But I still think it's worthwhile to play the pick 5 in these situations because, well, number one, the pick 5 is a much lower takeout wager than the pick 4 if you just skipped that reinvestment risk race. And also, just with that added leg in the mix, the wager often pays so much better just because it's a pick 5 versus a pick 4, but more things can happen, especially in some of the later legs. People lean a little bit more heavily on favorites. So, I mean, there's just more value to be had in the pick 5 overall. So I wouldn't shy away from a sequence just because it's going to begin with kind of a universal single.
No, I totally agree. That we've done shows before where I say I don't like the first leg, I'm going to skip it and play the pick 4. But that's usually because I don't really have an opinion in the first leg, and maybe there's a heavy favorite that I don't really like. But in this case, I like reinvestment risk. I think he's very much likely to win this race, far more than anyone else in the race. I have no negatives on him. So for all the reasons you said, the much lower takeout is a big factor, and that leads to what you talked about, the bigger payoffs. And even if a horse like reinvestment risk wins, it's not going to kill it's not like every single ticket has him singled. There's going to be people that spread and use other horses. So if a horse like him wins, even if you're eliminating 30% or 40% of the tickets, that gives you a big jump over a pick 4.
Totally agree about that. Well, hopefully we gave out some good opinions after reinvestment risk of the last 4 legs of this sequence. I know that we highlighted some bigger prices in all of those legs, and hopefully you're able to string together a ticket on this Saturday card at Saratoga. It's really great racing throughout the first weekend. I just completed the morning lines for the Sunday card this morning, and it continues the pattern of just excellent betting cards. The Friday card that is ahead of us after we finish the show is just loaded with difficult races. So the racing's been strong to kick off the season, hopefully, if it continues for the next 7 weeks of the Saratoga meet. Everybody, thanks for listening this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcasts, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and Craig and I will be back to recap some of these races on the TimeformUS Pacecast next Tuesday.